My name is Dr. Chris Jenkins, and I am the CEO of the Orianne Society and the host of the Snake Talk podcast, the podcast where you learn about nature's most feared, maligned, and persecuted animals. I invite you to listen to this conversation, and maybe you'll find that what you perceive as fear is actually rooted in a deep fascination. Welcome to the Snake Talk podcast. We have a great one for you guys today. We're going to talk about a really amazing animal with a really interesting human. And today we're going to talk with Mike Cardwell. And I've bumped into Mike at various kind of rattlesnake and viper related meetings over the years when I've been down in kind of the southwestern part of North America. And I really think, I kind of think of Mike as like the Mohave Rattlesnake guy. And, he wrote the book on it, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to just kind of listen to his story. It's maybe not the trajectory you might hear for a lot of people who have become, kind of rattlesnake researchers and conservationists. So excited to hear that story. And we're going to talk a lot about Mohaves, which are a fascinating animal that I've only seen a handful of in my life. So excited to learn more about them. Welcome to the podcast, Mike. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Chris. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's good to have you. So as you may know, if you've heard any episodes, I like to start from the very beginning because a lot of the world, thinks people like me and you are kind of odd in the fact that we like snakes. And so I like to hear everybody's like origin story. And so where did it start for you? Did your interest in snakes and rattlesnakes in particular, is that something that started as a child or something that happened to you later in life?
Yeah, no, it started when I was in grade school. I was born in Los Angeles, and my parents and I were living in the hills right near Griffith Park. Anybody that's familiar with LA knows that's where the LA Zoo is, and it's within sight of downtown. And I was in, I guess, about second grade, and my mother had a cat, and one night that cat brought in a little king snake. And I was just fascinated with this little snake. It wasn't injured. And my dad was an accountant. My mom was a tax preparer. So neither one of them were biologists. I don't know how they knew it wasn't dangerous, but somehow they did. And I wanted to keep it, and they allowed me to keep it. And I was just baffled by how this interesting little animal could move without legs, and how other people were really uncomfortable around it. And that was my introduction to snakes. I had this little pet king snake. My mom turned out was more afraid of mice than she was of snakes, but she brought some little mice home from a pet store. The snake ate the mice, and I was off and running as a snake keeper.
I was going to ask you if you had trouble getting that king snake to eat, but it ate right away, huh?
Well, I don't, I know I kept it for quite a while, so I know it ate. I know my mom brought mice home that she was more afraid of than the snakes. But they embraced my curiosity and let me run with it, and that was, and I've been forever thankful since then that they did that.
That's great. A little side story. I was out here in the southern Appalachians where I live. I was out on like a site visit with some people from the city, and we had this woman, and I had her out, and we were looking for salamanders in the creeks, and we found this. I flipped it's called a dwarf black-bellied salamander, and this woman She's great, but she like lost her mind in fear, like ran back down the trail, and all from this little 3-inch salamander. But then we get back to the lodge, and I've got snakes with me to show the group, and I pull out like a very impressive pine snake. We're talking like a big pine snake, like
Yeah.
6 feet long kind of snake, approaching that. And she no issues, just put it in her hand. And anyways, so sounds like somewhat similar to your mother there. But
But afraid of the salamander.
afraid of the salamander, but a giant snake, no problem. So anyways, the so your parents were very supportive of this as you grew up, and I'm assuming you had other snakes as you grew up. What where did you go from there? You obviously, I'm assuming you finished your childhood and high school days in Los Angeles area.
Yeah, my parents wanted to move out of Los Angeles, and before we got out of the LA basin, I guess we moved to the desert, the Mohave Desert in Southern California, when I was in junior high school. But in the meantime, I had made friends and was keeping a lot of snakes. And my parents, of course, encouraged me and bought me books and took me to meetings and that sort of thing. But in 1963, my parents had bought a lot in Apple Valley, which, if you've ever driven from LA to Las Vegas, you've driven right by it. It's in the Mohave Desert, and they built a house, and we moved. And come to find out, we're in the flat creosote bush, saltbush scrub habitat, and the most common snake was a Mohave rattlesnake.
Hmm.
And there were a few sidewinders around. In that part of the Mohave Desert, there are no diamondbacks, so and the most common snake was Mohave. And I was, of course, interested in them. And I became much more interested when people that I talked about Mojaves to were just horrified. And I heard all of these crazy stories about how aggressive they were and how they chase you and how they were so deadly. And I just didn't see that. So I got interested in, what makes these things tick, what makes people afraid of them. And, the next 60 years, it's been my passion.
Yeah, it's you can go most places in the country and you start talking to people, here in the Southeast, you can talk to people about snakes. And for some reason, the Mohave, not even the Mohave, the green Mohave is known by people as like one of the most deadly. And we're going to talk about venom and kind of the distribution of Mojaves and that in a little bit, but that's fascinating. So you're how old were you when you moved to this, what was it, Apple or Orchard Valley?
I think I was 13.
Gotcha. Okay. So at 13, you kind of were like brought into this playground with this animal that then became like huge focus for the rest of your life. So you're going through school, you're living amongst these snakes. I'm assuming you're spending time with them out in the wild, and
Sure.
I'm assuming you've maybe even brought a couple into captivity, or maybe your mom wouldn't allow that. But
I had a whole zoo, more than just rattlesnakes.
okay, great.
I was well known to the local game warden and my veterinarian, who was really helpful.
Okay, good. So you're finishing high school in the Mohave Desert, and you've got this interest in animals in general and this kind of specific animal in your backyard. Where did you go from high school? What was kind of the next step on your trajectory?
Of course, growing up, the more interested I became in the wildlife. And it wasn't just rattlesnakes and Mojaves. I was interested in a lot of animals that I thought people unreasonably feared, bats and spiders and things. But it turned out that rattlesnakes were the primary interest. So I majored in biology, through high school, started college at the local community college as a biology major. And 2 years into college, I was about to turn 21, and I had a four-wheel drive vehicle, and I had been volunteering with the local sheriff's search and rescue team. And at about the same time, I realized that it was going to be difficult to make a living as a wildlife biologist. I actually had a couple of friends in high school that were 2 years ahead of me. They graduated, came over to ASU up in Phoenix, and graduated with biology degrees, came back and couldn't find jobs as biologists. And both of them ended up teaching school, junior high school and high school for their whole careers. So just as I'm starting to have doubts about being able to make a living as a biologist, I'm about to turn 21, and the sheriff's sergeant that runs the search and rescue team talks me into applying to be a deputy sheriff. So I'd never thought about that before, but I thought, well, it's going to be interesting, probably a lot outdoors. I had some trepidations about it, but I applied, got hired, and the next 32 years I spent with the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, which is that big county that stretches from LA County all the way to the Colorado River, like 23,000 square miles, I think. Most of it desert, some mountains. But I spent 32 years being a cop. But I never lost my interest in the wildlife and the rattlesnakes.
Were you, throughout this career, were you still maintaining kind of, captive animals and doing the whole husbandry thing, or did that die off?
Off and on. But I was, I would teach venomous bites and stings classes to the academy students, and every time the Narcs would serve a search warrant and they'd, find a cage with rattlesnakes in it, they'd be sure there was drugs in the snake cage. So I'd get called to come and, get the snakes out of the cage so they could look for drugs. But yeah, I kind of had the reputation of the snake guy, but it was mostly law enforcement.
Gotcha. Did you end up, I'm sure you've had, like you mentioned, going into these houses where people had been arrested for drugs or they're searching for drugs. Did you ever just have any really kind of extreme kind of snake experiences? Any like species you may have found or anything like that? Or was it primarily kind of local rattlesnakes that you'd bump into in people's houses?
No, it was mostly local stuff. Of course, all of my fellow deputy sheriffs, most of them at least, weren't fond of snakes. Some of them were really petrified. I had a boss one time that we were serving, or I guess we were looking for a missing person up in the foothills, and we're in this kind of abandoned house, and there's a 55-gallon drum with a piece of plywood partly over the top of it. And this is a guy that had put a bullet through his desk in his office because somebody put a roadkill rattlesnake in his top desk drawer one time, which wasn't me, by the way. But, he, out of about 4 or 5 of us, he's the guy that goes over and takes his sunglasses off and slides the plywood over and sticks because there's a deep shadow in the barrel, you couldn't see the bottom, slides the plywood off and sticks his head in the top of the 55-gallon drum to see what's in there. And there was about half a dozen live rattlesnakes in there that, of course, all rattle. He jumps, turns the barrel over, getting away from it. And, of course, he makes a hole through the wall almost to get out of the house. So now we've got these live rattlesnakes crawling around in the house. But that was, I thought, kind of entertaining.
Yeah, that's great. So you've got this long career in law enforcement, and, you were able to kind of specialize and serve your community, not just in law enforcement, but also snake related issues. But how did you maintain the interest, obviously, but were you pretty inactive around snakes through those years? Did you come back to it after retirement, or were you out looking at the snakes and studying them and doing all of that right along?
Yeah, I was depending on assignments. I had a lot of assignments, got promoted over the years. But from time to time, I had some captives. And as I got close to the end of my career, I tried to go back to school at one point and finish a degree in zoology, because I had to change majors when I decided to go into law enforcement. And I tried to get back into school, and I just didn't have the schedule flexibility to do some of the big lab classes. But I got interested in it up to the point where my wife took a job in Sacramento. She had an offer she couldn't refuse. We bought a house in Sac. I was a few years from retirement, so I started renting down in San Bernardino. We had a long-distance relationship for about 6 years. And at that point, I had lots of time on my hands. I knew I was going to retire soon. And I had become friends with Sean Bush, who was an ER doc at Loma Linda, and Bill Hayes, who's a biologist, a rattlesnake guy that had just shown up at that point at Loma Linda. And Bill kind of took me under his wing as if I was a grad student. We became good friends. And he invited me down for a visiting lecture by Matt Good, who was a University of Arizona biologist. And he had a long-term radiotelemetry study going with tiger rattlesnakes up in a canyon where there's a golf course just north of town here. And I listened to that and thought, I can do that. Now I've got time. I wasn't working. I had time on my hands. So I went out and found a place I could study Mohave rattlesnakes, not far from where I lived. Talked to Dave Hardy, who has since passed. Dave was doing radiotelemetry with blacktails over by Portal with Harry Green. Dave taught me how to do the surgical implants of the transmitters. So while I was still working the last several years of my career, I started this radiotelemetry study of Mojaves there in the Mojave Desert, very near where I had grown up and gone to high school. And so at that point, I was off and running. And once I retired, I moved to Sacramento, went back to school, got eventually a master's in ecology, evolution, and conservation. And I was off and running, doing what I wanted to do as a kid.
Ah, okay, great. So do you still live in Sacramento then and then travel down to do your work?
No, my wife retired in 2004. And I'm sorry, I retired in 2004. She retired in 2017. And we bought the house here in Tucson before she retired. And as soon as she retired, we were already moved, and we've been here the last 8 years.
Gotcha. But you're still traveling out to California to work with the Mojaves, or are you working?
Not so much California now.
Okay.
I worked with Northern Pacifics when I was living in Sacramento, Crotalus oreganus, and now here in Tucson, I really my 4-year study on Mojaves in California was all the venom A. You probably know Mojaves are well known for producing, different populations produce different kinds of venom. Most of them produce this potent neurotoxin without much of the proteolytic enzymes in the venom. And then there's a population here in south central Arizona that oddly enough produces kind of typical rattlesnake venom that without the neurotoxin that does produce coagulation problems and tissue injuries and that sort of thing. So my Mohave study in California was all venom A snakes with the neurotoxin. When I came over to Tucson, I wanted to do a parallel study of venom B snakes, the ones that don't have the neurotoxin, because nobody's really figured out why there's this dichotomy of venom types. Been a lot of work done on it, but we're not sure why the same species of snake produces two different kinds of venom, and they integrate around the margins of the venom B area, but neither venom type seems to be spreading into the other populations. So since I've been here, I've been trying to get a Mohave study going, and oddly enough, it's been difficult to find a population of Mojaves that was dense enough in a place where I could do a telemetry study to replicate my California study. So I've done a lot of attempts, radio-tracked a lot of Mojaves here and there, but they're just not as common as they were in Southern California.
Yeah.
And
how? Let's talk a little bit about Mojaves, and I want to talk specifically about the California project, but what you've talked about California, you've talked about Tucson, and what's the general distribution of Mojaves? And then you talked about the venom differences. Are there subspecies? Are they all considered? What's the distribution of Mojaves, and how do they break out taxonomically, or are they all one thing? They just have different venom characteristics.
Well, the one species, Crotalus cucullatus, goes all the way from LA County in Southern California, around Palmdale, Lancaster, all the way across San Bernardino County, and it touches Kern County right in the north, just north of San Bernardino County, and then across the southern tip of Nevada, the whole southwestern, probably third of Arizona, and down into mainland Mexico. And it catches Washington County in southwestern Utah, and the southwestern Boot Hill of New Mexico, the Big Bend area of Texas, and then way down past Mexico City in Mexico. It breaks out into kind of 3 genetic clades. And there is a named subspecies that I think most of the geneticists now, which I am not, think that the subspecies that is Crotalus cucullatus salvini down right at the tip of their southern distribution, southeast of Mexico City, is probably not a valid subspecies, because of the 3 other clades, it is more closely related genetically to the Chihuahuan desert clade, rather than the one that the Mexican plateau clade is between salvini and the Chihuahuan desert clade, which is up around, Big Bend area and Sonora, Mexico. So there is a recognized subspecies, which, phylogenetically, just to look at it, it looks very different. But genetically, it's the same. But throughout that big range, almost all of them produce this potent neurotoxin that, by the way, is not nearly as deadly as everybody thinks. And we can talk about that before we're done. But there are little pockets of and individuals occasionally that don't have the neurotoxin and have tissue-destroying properties in their venom. In fact, while I was in Southern California, while Dr. Sean Bush was at Loma Linda, we had a guy come in from up around Phelan or Wrightwood with a Mohave bite. We had the snake, so he knew it was a Mohave. And he had a blood coagulation problem, which was really unusual for that population of Mojaves.
Yeah. Huh. So in the U.S., we have 2 of those clades, or do we have all 3 clades represented?
We probably have, we've certainly got the Mohave clade. We've got the northern part of the Chihuahuan desert clade. Yeah, we got just the 2. And then the Mexican highlands is completely south of the U.S. And then the salvini, what currently is described as a subspecies, is in a really small area around just southeast of Mexico City.
Yeah. And so it sounds like, so does the venom characteristics break out by these clades, or if I'm following what you're saying, it sounds like the more neurotoxic venom is the more widely distributed characteristic, and there's pockets of more tissue breaking down venom. So how does the venom break out?
Well, and there's other things besides the just the neurotoxin versus non-neurotoxin. There's myotoxins. A buddy of mine here in Tucson, Dan Massey, when he was doing his PharmD, his pharmacy doctorate, took a look at Mohave toxin across southern Arizona and found some potent myotoxins or muscle toxins down in Santa Cruz County and down around the Boot Heel of New Mexico that we don't find further north and west. But the predominant difference is neurotoxin versus as Steve McKessie likes to call it, um, tenderizers versus lethality venoms.
Mm-hmm. And so, what about diet? What do we know about diet? Because a lot of people, myself included, would assume that somehow the venom characteristics of the species are somehow associated with diet, things that they're adapted, to feeding on.
Yeah, I think I certainly would be surprised if it doesn't have something to do with diet. One of the best studies was done by a lady, Juliana Zancoli, who was a student of Wolfgang Worster's, and they did a really extensive sampling of diet around primarily southern Arizona. In fact, I contributed my diet data from my Mohave or my California study to that. But the only thing that they found statistically significant correlations with were a couple of what seemed like really minor meteorological differences. They didn't find any dietary differences, but most of the diet data that they had was not, a lot of it was just, bird, mammal, or reptile. I mean, it wasn't specific at all.
Yeah. Is there a direction to that meteorological difference? Like just say in colder areas, there's a higher prevalence of whatever tissue breaking down venom or anything like that.
Yeah. And I don't have the paper in front of me, but the factors that sorted out as significant were things like, temperature in the wettest quarter. I mean, really oddball things. But in my study in California, I had, I think, about 37 or 38 diet samples where either the snakes pooped in a bucket or I was able to massage a fecal bolus out when they were anesthetized. And while I was getting my master's, I spent a quarter doing a special project and looking at all of those fecal samples. And they were like 3/4 heteromeid rodents, most of them kangaroo rats. Mm-hmm. And heteromeids, are kangaroo rats and pocket mice and those little critters that have the fur-lined pouches in their cheeks. And they're pretty much seed eaters. And I actually saw my telemetered Mojaves strike and kill 2 kangaroo rats. And interestingly, both times the rats didn't get very far. And one of them, they strike and release, the rat jumps. And one of them, he only bounded about 2 or 3 times. And then he was wobbling around and collapsed. And the other one bounded a couple of times, got to a hole and went down. And both snakes tracked it. The one to the rat on the surface, the other one to the correct hole and went down the hole. And I've often wondered if that neurotoxin doesn't knock down those kangaroo rats quickly, because when they flee, of course, they've got those big hind legs and they bound away, and they don't leave a continuous chemical trail.
Yeah, they're going to leave. I was just going to speculate widely, and you just did exactly that, because when I worked on lutosis up in Idaho, and I was doing a lot of mammal trapping associated with that study, we'd catch kangaroo rats, and I was just thinking, well, these animals, one, due to their morphology, they have the potential to maybe go further, and also the potential, like you said, to not put as much of a ground trail. They spend more time in the air maybe than other small mammals. So it's interesting. So along that, our wild speculation there, like where you are now down in Tucson, would you have any reason to believe that the snakes that are there with this different type of venom aren't feeding on a lot of kangaroo rats? Hey everybody, I just wanted to take a quick break and tell you that the Orianne Society is dedicated to protecting some of North America's most at-risk species and their habitats, like eastern indigo snakes in the longleaf savannas, eastern hellbenders in the Appalachian highlands, and wood turtles in the great northern forests. Healthy ecosystems depend on these incredible animals, but these landscapes and species need our help to survive. If you care about reptiles, amphibians, and the wild places they call home, visit www.orien.org to learn more about our work and how you can get involved.
No, but it's been so difficult to get a population of Mojaves telemetered and keep them telemetered. We just don't see much. I haven't seen much predation, haven't seen much courtship. My 4 years in the California desert, I saw courtship, copulation, feeding, lots of actual feeding observations. And I sadly thought I was going to repeat that here. Diamondbacks, of course, are a dime a dozen, and we do catch them courting and feeding and such, but it's just hard to get Mojaves with radios in them. And most of the time when we do, they just sit around and hunt, and we don't find them eating things very often. It's just odd. And they seem to be, to me at least, and COVID kind of messed up what I was looking at, but I think we're the proportion of Mojaves that we see logged onto iNaturalist, for instance, compared to Diamondbacks is decreasing here in southern Arizona. And, I have to think that anybody that would report one species would report the other to iNaturalist. And we see a lot of Diamondbacks, and, you compare year to year, and you try and factor out like how many people are reporting and how many reports are there. There just seems to be fewer Mojaves over the last 6 or 7 years compared to Diamondbacks. So I'm not sure they're not doing well.
So are there any other ecological differences between the two? We'll call them the two venom areas, meaning you've got lower density, it sounds like, in one area, but anything else like differences in movements or size, are
not. Yeah. Not that I can tell. I mean, the record, the length records for Scutellatus are here from here in Arizona.
Yeah. Huh.
And, there just doesn't seem to be anything obvious. I did have a female just this last spring, right out of hibernation, swallow, and she wasn't a very big female actually, only about, I think, 750 or 800 millimeters, swallow an adult pack rat. A pack rat's a pretty large meal for a little, relatively small rattlesnake. And in fact, when I found her with the head in her mouth, I thought she'll never get that down. And I went off and checked on other snakes and came back, and there she was with a giant lump in her.
Oh.
But there's plenty of kangaroo rats, and I'm sure they feed on them, but they feed on other things too.
Yeah.
I mean, they're even the ones in California. I mean, they're opportunistic. They'll eat lizards, ground squirrels. I've never found feathers in their feces, but I have no doubt they would feed on a bird if they caught it.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're pretty generalized predators, but they may be more apt to be able to catch or to find after they strike kangaroo rats than maybe other rattlesnakes that whose venom doesn't knock those rats down as quick as Mojaves do.
Do we know anything? Again, we have these two. I know it's much more complex than that, but simplifying it to kind of these two venom types. Do we have any knowledge of how the venom composition changes, say, over the life of a snake, a young snake versus an old snake in either of those? Or is that just knowledge we don't have?
Well, no, I think we do. Like a lot of rattlesnakes have a more neurotoxic venom as neonates. I think the theory is that they feed on a lot of lizards when they're little, and that venom is probably maybe a little more potent on lizards. And then as they grow out of infancy, why they slowly change to more proteolytic venom. I know Steve McKessie calls the snakes that retain that kind of juvenile neurotoxicity, pedomorphosis, I think it is, where they kind of remain, they maintain their youthful venom qualities as they become adults. We see that with tigers and concolor, the little midget-faded rattlesnake that keep a pretty potent neurotoxin as adults.
Yeah. Well, let's we've kind of been talking about all kinds of things related to the snake, but let's back up and go back to California and talk about this 4-year study. So how did you kind of come up with the idea for it, and then how did you launch into this initial study of Mohaves?
I'm sure, like a lot of kids, I had looked at and actually made some crude attempts at radio telemetry much earlier in life, primarily transmitters, that you put in a mouse and feed the snake, and you can follow it until it defecates, and then it's gone. And that visiting lecture by Matt Good and talking about, being able to go out and find these snakes anytime you wanted to. And you go out and see what they're doing, document what they're doing. I mean, that just completely intrigued me. So as soon as I had the ability, I started doing that in 2001. And I went out to an area where I knew from when I was a kid, I could found a lot of Mohave rattlesnakes. And it was, in Northeast Apple Valley. And I put my first transmitter in September of 2001. And of course, and I was a male, and pretty soon I found another male, put another transmitter in. And by the time they hibernated a couple of months or so later, I had processed, I think, 18 or 19 Mohave rattlesnakes.
Ah, okay.
And this little study area was like 1,000 meters by 1,500 meters. At least that's what I restricted it to.
Yeah.
By the time I was done, when I went back and took the last of the transmitters out in 2005, I had 85 Mohave rattlesnakes in this 1,000 by 1,500 meter rectangle. So there was just a ton of rattlesnakes there.
What were they? What was their winter like? Were they overwintering for a consistent amount of time? I'm just not that familiar with the climate right there in that part of California. So were they underground for like a period of time, and then were they communal in how they did that, or did they kind of individually?
No, they were never communal. They overwinter in whatever rodent burrow is handy when the weather turns cold. They use kangaroo rat and ground squirrel burrows for the most part. And I, out of all 85 snakes, didn't all have transmitters in them. Obviously, I tried to keep 7 males and 7 females telemetered, but I never found a rattlesnake, a Mohave, spend the 2 consecutive winters in the same spot. I had 1 or 2 that went back to a place they'd used a couple of years before, but I think they just go down, just stay in whatever rodent burrow they're in when the weather gets cold. If you have a warm day during the winter, it's not unusual to find them out basking in the sun, within a foot or so of whatever burrow they're spending the winter in. I was collecting a ton of data during those 4 years, and one of them involved, shade temperatures and sun temperatures. And one winter, I was at a bush where I had a Mohave wintering underground, and I was using a little mercury thermometer, and I laid it out on the ground to get the air temperature, and I'm counting the transmitter beeps to get the snake's body temperature, and I realize that transmitter is beeping pretty fast. That snake's warm. And I start looking around, and I had set this transmitter down like about 8 inches from a coiled Mohave who was on the surface in the sun, never moved, never rattled, but he was warm. Yep. He was laying there in the sun. And I just set the thermometer down blindly and without, assuming he's underground somewhere.
Yeah. What did this study site look like? Was there much topography? Was it kind of more
Not,
sandy soils? What was the
yeah,
vegetation
not
like?
much. It was pretty gravelly soil. There was a big dry or ephemeral stream, an arroyo that went down through the middle of it. Joshua trees, a lot of creosote bushes, a lot of salt bush, and lots and lots of rodents, lots and lots of lizards. And, there's not much topography at all. It was right at the foot of some granite mountains, but the Mojaves never ventured into the rocks. As a kid, I would find speckled rattlesnakes, Crotalus pyrrhus, down in the flats around that mountain. But during the Mojave study, I figured sooner or later I'd find a speckled down in the desert there. I never did. But the Mojaves were all over the place there. And there were, I had a pregnant snake one year that I figured I'd find it with babies. Never found it with its babies. But that was a year that it didn't rain all summer. So I'm not sure if they were stillborn, but she never settled down. And one day she wasn't pregnant and she wasn't with her kids and she was still moving. So, but it turned out that first year, it was 2002, I didn't have a drop of rain at my study site. And then 2003 and 2004, rainfall was average or a little above average. So fast forward, a decade, in grad school, I needed a thesis project, and my committee let me use those data from those 4 years and to compare Mojave rattlesnake behavior between the drought year and the 2 non-drought years, which ended up being my thesis.
Okay. Well, I want to get to that, but I have a couple other just kind of basic ecological natural history questions. So first of all, like, what did you learn about just like general movements in these snakes? Were they moving far? Did they have large, small home ranges? Were you seeing big differences, say, between males and non-gravid females compared to gravid females? Like, what did you just kind of generally learn about Mohave rattlesnake movements?
Yeah, I was disappointed that other than that one pregnant rattlesnake that I processed in 2002 that I never found with any babies, I never really had other gravid females. I saw a lot of courtship and reproduction, never saw any birth or any, I'd find neonates, but not litters from my telemetered snakes. But the males definitely have larger home ranges than females. And they're obviously not monogamous. The males during the spring and late summer and fall, they wander widely looking for females. The females will hang out in a relatively small home range. When I talk to people, I kind of equate it to NFL football fields, where some of those females had a home range that was smaller than an NFL football field, where the males might very well have a home range of the size of several NFL football fields. And, like a lot of other animals, the females hang around where there's resources, where there's shelter and food and a good place to thermoregulate when they're pregnant. And then the males, during the courtship season, wander around and look for the females. And it was my belief that, the males sometime, especially in the spring, they'd rather find a female than a ground squirrel or a kangaroo rat. And they often don't shed. They often don't feed until the courtship season winds down in May. But there were big differences in individual snakes in home range size too. Some of them, especially the females, would have a little itty bitty home range, maybe just a 200 or 300 meters across, and others would have a larger home range. And the perimeters or the margins of those home ranges, both males and females, would change from year to year. But these snakes don't just pick up and go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. The core of their home range remains the same year after year.
Yeah. And you mentioned you only had the one gravid female that you were tracking, but that you'd seen other litters. Where were the gravid females going to give birth? Were there like specific types of places like you see with many other rattlesnakes, or more like overwintering? It was kind of varied quite a bit.
Yeah. I only had in 4 years, 4.5 years, I only had that one pregnant female, and I never saw her give birth. And the neonates that I found were all individuals. I never found a group, never found, of course, I assumed I was going to find, kids hanging with mom, just like, and finally did do that here in Arizona. One of the kind of accomplishments with the Mojaves here, we did find a female that gave birth and did stay with her. The kids stayed with mom until they shed, just like other species. But that's the only one I've seen, and that was here in Tucson, 2000, I think it was.
Yeah. How about just their general activity? A lot of rattlesnakes are known to be very active nocturnally, but then you have others like eastern diamondbacks down here in the southeast. Even though it's a pretty warm climate in most of the places you find them, they're typically very diurnal type snakes. So what did you see anything kind of like nocturnal, diurnal activity patterns with the snakes?
No, I believe at least with the Mojaves, it's temperature driven.
Mm-hmm.
And my belief is that if they're not doing something else, they're on the surface hunting as long as it's not too hot or too cold. And by something else, I mean if they're not courting or hibernating or underground during a shed cycle, they'll go underground when they're going to shed. And sometimes you'll find the shed skin hanging out of the burrow where they've been for the last week. But yeah, if it's not too hot or too cold, they're generally going to be coiled up someplace trying to find something to eat.
Yeah,
I don't think they feed underground often, if at all. They're ambush hunters on the surface.
Hey everybody, I just wanted to take a break and tell you guys that snakes are one of the most persecuted groups of animals in the world, but we are dedicated to changing that. The Orianne Society works every day to ensure there's a future for these amazing animals. If you care about snakes, wildlife, or wild places, and you like what you've been hearing on the Snake Talk podcast, support us today by donating on our website at www.orianne.org.
How about like general life histories? And when I say that, I mean, when we think of like some rattlesnake species have real extreme life histories, say like timber rattlesnakes, the group I work with a lot, they, in some places they're known to have real late sexual maturity, long intervals between pregnancies, small numbers of offspring, low survival of neonates, those types of things. Just these real extreme, long-lived animal type life histories. Like, what is the life history? How would you characterize it of a Mohave in California?
Well, I actually published a paper. Excuse me. Excuse me. Let me grab a drink of water here.
Please do.
I actually published a paper, one of my first papers from that study about the reproductive biology and looking at the size of the rattlesnakes that I found courting and mating. And I had a large enough sample size that I could pretty much tell you that the males were sexually mature and courting and copulating at about a year
of
age. And the females probably early in their second year.
Okay.
So they were not waiting very long. They were sexually mature a year to a year and a half, depending on the sex, after they were born. And they seem to, I don't think they're particularly long-lived, but I don't know. I've got one here in my office that is close to 20 years old. But I know Bill Brown had a horridus up in the northern Appalachian Mountains. A few years ago, he said he'd found a shed skin of one that he'd scale clipped almost a half century before. So, I don't know that they're that long lived, but they sexually mature pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And I think, my belief is that they probably would reproduce annually if the summer season is long enough and food is plentiful enough, but it may very well be that it takes them a year or two to replace enough body fat to sustain another pregnancy. But they're constantly courting and mating.
Okay. Well, how about let's. So you learned quite a bit in California, and now you're in Arizona. We've already talked about kind of comparisons there. It sounds like lower densities down south of Tucson, which makes them more difficult to study. Also, sounds like there's a venom difference. There's obvious habitat differences between the two ranges. Like, what have you? I know it's been challenging down in Arizona, but what have you learned in your studies in Arizona? Anything else worth kind of comparing and contrasting with what you learned up in the Mojave Desert?
Well, the little bit that I've seen here, I think their behavior is pretty similar to what I saw in the Mojave Desert. Although, I had 3,700, encounters documented in my 4-year study in California, and I don't have just a few hundred documented here in the last 8 years. But I think it's pretty similar. I never saw them hang out in a pack rat midden in California, and there were pack rat middens on my study site there. Here, they're in pack rat middens all the time, and as I say, this spring, I had a little female actually kill and swallow an adult pack rat. So, why they hang out in pack rat middens here and they didn't in California, I don't know. Of course, they live side by side with diamondbacks here. And, they seem to be, the two species seem to be pretty similar in their habits and their behavior. We see the diamondbacks hanging out in dry washes more frequently than the Mojaves, but the Mojaves will be just a few yards away out of the wash. And they just like California, the Mojaves here, and the diamondbacks for that matter, because I've had a number of diamondbacks telemetered also, they're spending the winter in rodent burrows. They're not migrating to rocky hills and going down crevices and rocks and that sort of thing. I haven't found them overwintering together yet, although we did have an interesting observation about 3 springs ago where we had a male diamondback emerge in the spring, made a straight line movement almost 100 meters to a pack rat midden where there was a female diamondback that had spent the winter there. He goes underground with her. The next day, at a third location, a female Mojave emerges from where an underground rodent burrow where she'd spent the winter and makes a beeline to the same pack rat midden. And for the better part of a week, those 3 snakes hung out in that pack rat midden. And the male diamondback and the female Mojave would come out right in front of the opening and coil in the sun and bask, sometimes touching each other, most of the time not. And then, when we get too hot or whatever, they'd go back into the midden. I looked and looked, watched and watched for any sign of courtship. Never saw the male show any interest in the female Mohave, but they definitely hung out together, which I thought was pretty doggone interesting.
Did they go there to shed by chance?
No? I mean, this was right out of
right out of
hibernation.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Their first moves from where they spent the winter, they ended up together within a couple of days of each other.
Interesting. Huh. Well,
yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, sounds like there's still a lot to learn, and hope you continue working on that. Let's talk a little bit about your book. I mean, obviously, a lot of the things we've been talking about would be in that, but tell everybody about your book, kind of what the book's titled, where they can find it, and if they do purchase it, like what they'll find within it.
Yeah, it's a passion of mine that I've had for decades. I've made notes off and on over the years. And the title is The Mohave Rattlesnake and How It Became an Urban Legend. It was published down in Rodeo by Bob Ashley and Bob and Sherry Ashley and Eco Publishing. You can get it on Amazon or from Eco Publishing online. And it's really, in the beginning, is a more detailed explanation of how and why I got interested in rattlesnakes and other animals I thought people were unreasonably afraid of, and the whole business about moving to Apple Valley and that sort of thing. And, there's chapters on how to identify them. There's a lot of photographs of oddball colors and patterns and that sort of thing that I've been thankful that other folks have let me use. And then there's chapters on behavior and snake bite and even whether you spell Mojave with an H or a J, a lot more detail than you probably want. But there's a lot of good snake lore in there. I think the first printing is about to run out, and I want to do a revised edition for a couple of reasons. One, now we know that the babies hang with the females just like we kind of assumed they would, but it's documented with so many other rattlesnakes. And then we had the one instance here where we had a telemetered female give birth and found her babies with her until they all shed. Another thing that will be in there is, for the longest time, I also believed that Mojaves had this potent neurotoxin that could cause respiratory paralysis. And that's why people were so interested in the species. And I ended up working with the Poison Center here at the College of Pharmacy at the University of Arizona and talking to the guy that's the education director, Dr. Jeff Smelsky. And he said something that intrigued me a few years ago. We were talking about Mojaves, and he says, well, I don't see respiratory paralysis here, and we have a lot of Mohave bites. Show me some data. I said, okay, sure. I figured I'd go pull a few papers and take them back to him. And I looked and looked and looked and looked, and I couldn't find any documented cases where Mohave bites had caused respiratory paralysis, with the exception of one that I happened to be familiar with from Southern California back in the 90s. So long story short, we ended up publishing a paper several years ago about respiratory paralysis being pretty much absent in rattlesnake bites in southwestern U.S. And we have a lot of Mohave bites. Of course, some of them are from that population that doesn't have the neurotoxin, but the whole south and west around that area, there's plenty of bites that do have the neurotoxin. The toxicologists believe, like most toxins, the effect is dose dependent. And, it was really potent in pigeons initially, and then it was tested in mice. There have been a lot of tests over the years where neurotoxic Mohave venom scores very high on the lethality tests with lab animals. And the toxicologists tell me, if we scaled the dose that was given to all those pigeons and mice up to the corresponding dose for a human, we might see paralysis. But you just don't see it clinically. You see a few telltale neurotoxic signs, what they call ptosis, the inability to hold your eyelids up. But we just don't see life-threatening neurotoxicity with bites from these guys. So, that's kind of an interesting thing as well. That's not to say they can't produce a fatal bite. They can't produce a very dangerous bite, but now we don't think they're any more or less dangerous than diamondbacks or other species of similar size.
Yeah. Huh. Well, I encourage everybody to get out there and purchase the first version. And if the second edition does come out, pick that up as well. So, Mike, I like to have all of my guests tell me a snake story. So, what's your best snake story?
Well, thinking about Mojaves and about them being aggressive, and I've never had a snake, a Mohave or any other snake, chase me, but twice I've had little Mojaves and rattlesnakes, diamondbacks, Mojaves, and I'm sure other species. They have individual personalities. Some of them are kick back and don't care. Others are really nervous and defensive. But twice I've had little Mojaves that just had a bad attitude, and they would coil and strike and strike and strike. And in both cases, they were small enough and they would strike with so much force that they would drag their body an inch or two each time they struck. And, when you're in one case, I was knelt down trying to take some data. And in the other case, I was trying to keep the snake on the road while my wife got a bucket and hook out of the truck, and I was in sandals. And these little guys, they're not intentionally advancing on you, but when you're well out of strike range, and they just keep striking and striking and dragging their body each time they strike, to the point you've got to retreat, especially if you're in sandals. It's just interesting that they just have these individual personalities. The first one was in Apple Valley, and it was a snake that I didn't put a transmitter in. And I came across the same snake again a couple of years later, had the exact same behavior. So it wasn't like it had just had a run-in with a kit fox or something. That little snake just had a bad attitude and just struck and struck and struck. And they're just weird.
Yeah. No, I always tell people that when I give presentations that, snakes are like people. They have different personalities. Yep. Some rattlesnakes just rattle all the time, and it's very hard to get others to rattle at all. So, yeah. But anyways, great. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today, Mike. I enjoyed our conversation, and I learned quite a bit about Mojaves. So, thanks.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Great. And just wanted to thank the audience and tell everybody to remember snakes are animals too, and it's a privilege to see one in the wild.